You know what they ought to do? They ought to release the J6 hostages. They've suffered enough. They ought to release them. I call them hostages. Some people call them prisoners. I call them hostages. Release the J6 hostages, Joe. Release them, Joe. You can do it real easy, Joe.
So there was Trump floating the new line coming out of the GOP when it comes to the folks who participated in an insurrection at the behest of Donald Trump himself, Rudy Giuliani, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, many leading Republicans around the country. Hostages. No, they're not tourists anymore. They're not Antifa. They're not political prisoners. No, that's for, black and brown people. Hostages. Hold that thought. Wonder where we've heard hostages before. He's actually not the only Republican who's floating this hostages line, reflecting on this third anniversary of January 6th. Here is Elise Stefanik on Meet the Press.
Do you still think it was a tragic day? Do you think that the people who stormed the Capitol should be held responsible to the full extent of the law?
I have concerns about the treatment of January 6 hostages. I have concerns. We have a role in Congress of oversight over our treatments of prisoners. And I believe that we're seeing the weaponization of the federal government against not just President Trump, but we're seeing it against conservatives. We're seeing it against Catholics.
Catholics? Okay, I love when people just throw in like right wingers, just the rule of threes, Catholics, sure, why not? But Ray, I wanna get your take before we move on to the actual facts about how Jan 6ers and people who participated in the riot are being treated by the justice system. But to zero in on this word hostages, because you and I have been covering a lot of what's been going on in the Middle East, the war on Gaza, the assault on Gaza. The word hostages kind of feels like a little bit of stolen valor from actual hostages in Gaza who are being held by Hamas still. Ostensibly there's a attempt to rescue them. But what do you make of this new word?
Well, first, I can't get over the claim that Catholics are being persecuted in this country. That took me aback, and I'd seen that clip before, but I guess it just missed me the first time. Catholics? Where? I'd like to see some evidence of that. That's actually so funny. But when it comes to, yeah, you're right, the term hostages, he's borrowing from what he's seen as a very successful campaign of public pressure that's worked in relation to Israel, because of course there's Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. There's also, and what I think is interesting and upsetting here, is there are people being held in prisons as hostages. There are Palestinian men, women, and children who are being held in Israeli jails, not pending charges, not awaiting a trial, not awaiting sentencing. They're just being administratively detained in that country. And it's horrendous. And the correct term for them is not prisoner, it's hostage. So they're not asking for prisoner exchanges when they're doing these negotiations. They're hostage swaps is what's going on there. So to see them misappropriate that term and try to apply it to people who, most of them on video and a lot of them openly admitting it on all of their social media, engaged in a violent insurrection. People died. Like January 6th is sort of, I think we're at the point where we can joke a little bit about it, but people died that day. It was violent. They were chanting, kill, hang Mike Pence. They were chanting to kill Nancy Pelosi. There were calls for AOC's death. These politicians, these Democratic politicians, particularly in the lead up to January 6th, saw a rise in violent threats coming into their offices. And some of the people who were sending those violent threats were the people who were there on January 6th, breaching the Capitol. So the idea that the people who are being detained, and we'll talk about this in a second, it's a small portion of the people who were there that day. The people who have been, detained, but who have been charged, who are serving out sentences. The idea that they are hostages it's exactly just Donald Trump trying to tap into the language that is actually evoking emotion in people in a situation where it actually applies, and trying to misapply it here.
For sure, and we're gonna get into new footage from Jan 6, and like you said, The Intercept did a deep dive as to the justice that these folks are facing or not facing. But I just wanna quickly, before we move on from the word hostages, if this were a Democrat using the word hostage, Elise Stefanik would drag her own self in front of her anti-Semitism hearing and chide herself, and then she would be fired. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is a woman who successfully took down 2 university presidents over so-called claims of anti-Semitism. Now she's calling Jan 6ers hostages. Don't get me started on the Israeli lobby and AIPAC actually supporting some of these insurrectionist candidates, people who don't believe the 2020 election. Again, it's right-wing money, people. They can do it. They can be anti-Semitic, but the left gets called anti-Semitic.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.